Good day, sir. I'm Noella May Villarta from BSE Social Studies, and I'm here to discuss the types of listeners and listening. So, what are the types of listeners and listening? But before that, let's identify first their differences. What is listeners and listening? Listeners is the person who's paying attention to someone in order to hear what is being said, while the listening, it is the process of receiving and responding to a spoken or in a non-verbal message. Types of listeners. There are many types of listeners, and those are active listeners, passive listeners, non-listeners, marginal listeners, and evaluative listeners. Active listener involve themselves actively in the communication process. They're listening not only to the message but also to the way it has been delivered. This means that they will take note of the verbal content along with its nonverbal subtext. They will not hesitate to seek clarifications, ask leading questions. Active listener is the person who actively in communication process. They focus on the content as well the manner in which it is delivered. The message sent will be received correctly, and the feedback is given in a favorable manner. So, it leads to a win-to-win situation and causes effective communication. Passive listeners exhibit exactly the opposite behavioristic traits of active listeners. They allow someone to speak without interrupting or seeking clarifications. Passive listeners, they pay attention only to the partial message and lack sensitivity in the inner meanings involved in communication. Passive listening is actually hearing, not listening. Since passive listeners keep their mind closed, communication with them is futile and incomplete. Non-listener. The non-listeners do not listen at all because they are genuinely disinterested in the subject. Although they frequently interrupt by saying I understand and I know, they actually do not know anything or understand the subject. Non-listener, they do not listen in a whole message. And these people, they are pretending that they are following the speaker. Marginal listener, impatient to listen to the main ideas. Marginal listener pay attention and are interested only in the bottom line. Marginal listeners pay attention only in the bottom line. It is risky to communicate with the marginal listeners because they are not focusing in the main idea. Evaluative listeners literally assess the verbal content and the basis of words, not paralinguistic or nonverbal cues. Generally, they use logic to understand the content, hence they distance themselves emotionally from the subject. So, most of us are evaluative listeners because without paying attention to the content, we always evaluate the message. So let's now proceed to the types of listening. There are also 5 types of listenings, and those are appreciative listening, empathetic listening, comprehensive listening, critical listening, and discriminative listening. Appreciative listening is when you listen for appreciation, you are listening for enjoyment. It doesn't require much focus, nor does it result in much retention. So, appreciative listening, from the word itself, appreciate. So, it is when we listening for a pleasure and an enjoyment. So as we listen to a music, comedy, and for an entertainment speech. Empathetic listening is when we listen empathetically, we go beyond sympathy to seek a truer understand how others are feeling. So it is listening to provide emotional support for the speaker, as when a psychiatrist listens to a patient or when we lend a sympathetic ear to a friend. So, empathetic listening focuses on understanding and identifying with the person's situation, feelings, and motives. There is an attempt to understand what the other person feelings. Comprehensive listening involves understanding the message or messages that are being communicated. Comprehensive listening is a listening to understand the message of a speaker, as when we attend to a classroom lecture or listen a directions for finding our friend's house. Critical listening is listening to evaluative the content of the message. It is listening to evaluate the message for purposes of accepting or rejecting it, as when we listen to a sales speech of a used car dealer or the campaign speech of a political candidate. Critical listening focuses on evaluating whether a message is logical or reasonable. And last, discriminative listening. This is the most basic form of listening and does not involve the understanding of the meaning of words or phrases, but merely the different sounds that are produced. Discriminative listening is first developed at a very early age, perhaps even before birth in the womb. In early childhood, for example, a distinction is made between a sound of a voice of the parent that voice of a father sounds different to that of the mother. So, as we grow older and develop and gain more life experience, our ability to distinguish between different sounds are improved. So, that's all the types of listening and listening. But before I leave, I will give some summary of the report. So, this is the summary of the report. Question number 1 is, what is listener? Listener is the person who's paying attention to someone in order to hear what is being said. Question number 2, what is listening? Listening is the process of receiving and responding to a spoke or a nonverbal message. Number 3, differentiate the listener and listening. Listener, it is the person who is listening, while the listening, it is the process of receiving. Question number 4 is, what are the types of listener? These are the types of listener: active listener, passive listener, non-listener, marginal listener, and evaluative listener. And for the last question, what are the 5 types of listening? So these are the 5 types of listening: appreciative listening, empathetic listening, comprehensive listening, critical listening, and discriminative listening. So that's all my report, and this is the references.